Good evening, good night. I'm glad to be back in Berlin and back at the Hertie School. But like the river in which you never step twice, the Hertie School is a school in which you never step twice. Last time I was here, it was somewhere else, and now it's here. And possibly next time, it could even be somewhere else, I suspect, although we hope not. I want to thank Michael Cern and Ulrich Preuss and Klaus Offa for their willingness to consider, when I was here a year and a half or so ago, the possibilities of our working together and doing a conference. And you should know that this conference on public space here is actually an ongoing part of an international research program that really started in Mexico City at Interdependence Day 2 years ago with a large panel on what was called then the art of public space. And then, thanks very much also to the support of the Hertie School, last spring in London, we did a conference there on the art of public space. Just a few weeks ago in Brussels, in the 6th Interdependence Day, we devoted 2 extensive panels to common space, the problems of common space, and now here at this opening conference of the new home of the Hertie School, we come to it again. And by the way, I want to say that in the spring, we hope to have in New York at Demos a follow-up and continuing conference. So this is not a one-time conference, but really a part of an ongoing research program that is focused on common space, public space, in its relationship to democracy and to the many themes that Michael Cern already has pointed, and to which, as he said many years ago, Habermas was already beginning to think. We were hoping Habermas might be with us, but actually as I came over here, he came to New York. So Habermas is in New York this week, and unfortunately couldn't be part of this, but we hope at some point perhaps we can get him to help us think about what has changed in the 45, 46 years since he first published on the subject. Klaus and I would like tonight to introduce the subject. I don't think we'll take strong stands, at least I won't. I certainly will take strong stands in the course of the conference, but here we want to outline, I think, some of the themes, and Michael Cern has already done a nice job of pointing to some of the highlights, the key topics, and I want to just go a little deeper into those and try to suggest what really the problem is that we're trying to investigate and why we focus on public space, because there's a lot of discussions of Öffentlichkeit, of public things, of the nature of the public sphere, but this is focused on space, and that's not just a metaphor. We actually are focused on physical or virtual spaces where we, I think it is our premise, believe the work of democracy, the work of citizenship, and the work of civil society are done. So that in speaking about public space, we are talking about the physical and nowadays the virtual infrastructure that actually facilitates the gathering of people into civil society in ways that make democracy possible. So implicitly, without it even being in the title, this is a debate, a discussion about democracy, and to the extent it's about the decline of public space, it's about a democratic deficit. And as you will see towards the end of my remarks, I'm actually going to link our discussion of public space to the latest piece of evidence for the deep democratic deficit of the West, namely the banking and fiscal crisis that we now face. And I want to suggest to you there's a powerful and largely unrecognized connection between the decline of public space and the rise of mistrust and in capitalism and a financial crisis that has now touched around the world and threatens to continue to involve the pensions and funds and jobs of many, many people all over the world. So I start then simply with the assumption that democracy itself is defined in its classical form by things political. That term republic comes from res publica, the things of the public. And when we talk about democracy, we're talking about the things of the public, the things we have in common, the things we share, And those are, by definition, things of res publica which require public spaces to emerge. Another way to put this is that you're not going to get res publica, you're not going to get social capital, you're not going to get common goods emerging from your bedroom, or from watching television, or from, as Robert Putnam suggested, bowling alone. Those are all vital places in our lives, but they are private places, personal places, solitary places. And in their presence, the public is absent. In the long history of political theory, particularly in the West, but you can do this analysis almost anywhere, and social and cultural anthropologists from around the world could share in it, we know that the great places of our democratic civilization, at least, have been defined by significant places that play an extraordinary role. The ancient Greek polis, the polis itself had a sense of space and place to it, and that defining institution of the polis, the agora, which was both a marketplace and a public space and a place of meeting and a place of intercourse and a place of exchange. The agora was clearly crucial, in some ways even more so than the Pnyx. The Pnyx was the hill on which the Greek assembly met, but without the agora, what happened in the Pnyx, what happened when the Greek assembly met, would not have been possible. Go to Barcelona, to the Ramblas, the great corridors of human traffic where we walk, pedestrian places where we walk. Walter Benjamin wrote about the arcades. In his arcade project, he is helping to define public spaces. Spaces where we encounter one another. Every American town has a park square. Every British town has a commons. And those, again, were the term, the commons, is obviously a term that points to that commonality of space. But even where we don't have a commons or a ramblas or an arcade, most societies figure out meeting places not necessarily intended for democratic, social, and civic purposes that become that. Small town America, small town Britain, the post office becomes a kind of public meeting place, a public space where people come together, encounter one another, and things happen. A barber shop can do that. A cafe or diner in the 18th century, the British coffee house. Those play a role not just as private places where we entertain and meet one another, but also as public places where public debate, public discussion, public speculation takes place. And even street corners, even sidewalks are crucial. I think we forget how much of a role sidewalks play as public spaces in the way in which they connect the private spaces where we live and shop and work. And of course, into the streets has become a cry of revolutionaries everywhere, because going into the streets is to go into a public space where it's possible then to make political statements and do political things. And as I'll point out in a minute, one of the primary signs of the decline of public space is the fact that in suburban parts of the world, particularly the United States, but more and more elsewhere as well, when you go there, you find towns without sidewalks. And towns without sidewalks means towns without bicycles, towns without traffic, people walking back and forth. It means towns without front porches, because what's the point of a front porch if there's a highway running in front of your house but no sidewalk? The front porch is a place where you wave to, talk to people on the sidewalk. So that even sidewalks are public spaces that engender a sense of fellowship, community, sometimes conflict, arguments, all of which are crucial to public space and thus to democracy. Yet, though we know, every student, every sociologist, every student, every citizen knows how vital these spaces are to our existence as citizens, to the possibilities of liberty, public liberty, and to the promise of social capital, that vital asset which allows people with differences and conflicts to nonetheless work together towards common norms. We know that, in fact, common space has been under attack, eroding, declining probably at least since World War II, 1962, 1963, the beginning of the 60s. Habermas was already writing about it, but so was Richard Sennett writing about it at the end of the 1960s, beginning of the 1970s. A lot of people were beginning to recognize that the public space is so vital, informally, to the life of democracy, the life of citizenship, so crucial in generating that social capital that holds peoples together in precisely modern societies, where conflicts, multiculturalism, scale make holding people together much tougher. So social capital becomes much more important because it's the counterweight to all the centrifugal forces that tear us apart in large-scale modern centrifugal societies. So any centripetal force we can have, like social capital, is crucial. Yet we have seen a series of developments that have undermined social capital, undermined democracy, because they have undermined public space. And Michael Cern mentioned several of them. I know Klaus is going to talk about them, but let me just mention 5 of them and say a brief word about each of them in the way of helping to set a kind of agenda focus that the papers will be hearing over the next several days. Will be here, there, but I think you'll find that they are contained within this framework. The 5 themes are suburbanization, privatization, marketization, globalization, and digitalization. Forgive me for all the zations, but that's how the English language works. Too many nouns. And let's just look at each of them, because when you put together those 5 sets of intersecting forces, you find that public space is not merely eroding, not merely under assault, but literally in danger of vanishing from our lives in ways that are deeply pernicious to citizenship, social capital, and democracy. To just jump forward for a second to where I want to go towards the end of my remarks, I would argue that the erosion of public space is directly, not indirectly, visible in the fiscal and banking crisis that we face today, in a way that I'm going to briefly try to suggest here. Keep in mind that when I talk about public space, there's one key piece of it that sometimes goes missing in discussions and makes it clear why some of the spaces we think are public, common, social, are really not. And when I talk about the internet, you'll see what that is. When we talk about public space, we don't just talk about spaces where neighbors and friends visit one another, chat with one another, interact with one another, discover common goals. We talk about the spaces in which we encounter one another as strangers who may not like each other, who may not share interests, and who may be in conflict. And space is only public, at least as I understand it, when such encounters take place. That's why, in a certain sense, an intense church community, a group of people who come together to talk about a common subject, a bridge club, are, well, they're in some ways public, but by my definition, they don't meet the full meaning of the democratic public, because those are the spaces where everyone and anyone can be, and indeed must be, to participate in power. And there are always spaces that include adversaries, as well as friends and allies, that include strangers, as well as neighbors, and include people different from us, as well as people like us. So to be public, there's that heavier weight, at least in the way I'm talking about it. And these 5 sets of forces have particularly undermined, as I understand it, this form of public space. But let me start with suburbanization, because it is, for a variety of reasons in the United States, it had to do with the rise of the automobile, the highway system, American individualism, the failure to develop adequate mass transportation, and the preference of Americans in any case for the automobile, and you might say the preference of the steel industry, the rubber industry, and the gasoline industry for the automobile as well. It didn't just happen that the American public rose up and said, give us automobiles. There were a lot of powerful corporate forces that helped a decision get made in Congress after World War II to develop a powerful interstate highway system, but not a powerful interstate rail system. But that led and helped suburbanization. Cars allowed us our way out. And the chief characteristic of the suburb is the absence of the spaces typical of cities, towns, and villages throughout the last several thousand years. Many are formless. Few have genuine centers. I lived for years when I taught at Rutgers University in Piscataway, New Jersey. And sometimes friends from overseas or from California would come to visit me, and we'd have a nice dinner, and they said, let's go to town. Let's go visit town. I quite literally had nowhere to take them. There was no town center of any kind. The school and police department were in one piece of rural land. There were some factories in another. There were a number of shopping malls. But there was no such thing as town. And a lot of the suburban world doesn't have a locus, doesn't have a center, doesn't have a place that people can move to, whether they're teenagers looking for action, old people looking for company and safety, or ordinary citizens looking to talk about the latest election, the latest scandal from the Capitol. And I've mentioned already the absence of sidewalks in so many of those places. One of the simplest things that having no sidewalks does, it means you can't have bicycles. If you can't have bicycles, it means children can't go up and down the block and get to know other children, and most people get to know others in family settings through their children. It's children who actually help socialize adult communities. When children can't, in effect, play because there's no space they can move back and forth on without being driven around by their parents in cars, then public space literally disappears. The mall itself, of course, has become the surrogate for public space in suburbs all over America and in many other places now as well. And the mall is characterized, the mall is defined precisely by the absence of public space. In about half the states of the United States, state Supreme Courts have actually declared that mall space is private and not public. So when people try to leaflet or speak or come and demonstrate, they can be thrown out. Indeed, the security guards can throw out teenagers who come just to hang out, as teenagers are wont to do, if they're seen as a problem, because it's a private, not a public space. Some other state courts have tried to declare that those spaces are public. But you will find, for example, in most malls in America, particularly in middle class and upscale malls, there is no public transportation to them. So there's no way to get to them unless you have a car. Of course, if you're poor, you probably don't have a car, which means that you can't get to them, and that's the point. You haven't got enough to spend, and you're not wanted in those spaces. So malls are typical examples of spaces that not only don't have a public character, but actually deny intentionally their public character in order to control the population, to depoliticize the spaces, and assure that they are devoted to their only task, which is selling consumer goods and consumer services and movies and so forth. You'll find malls don't even have restaurants. They have food courts, because restaurants, people sit around for 2 or 3 hours, and restaurants are a little like public spaces. People are in danger of sitting around for 2 or 3 hours and meeting friends and talking. And the result is that most American malls simply don't have those kinds of restaurants. They have food courts where you fuel up in order to continue shopping. Few of them even have what the classic arcades all had, spaces to sit and watch. People watching is one of the things sociologists will tell you, that and anthropologists too, bring people into public spaces. We like to look at each other, watch each other. And that's a great way of beginning to learn about people who are different, being friendly with people who are the same. And malls, of course, you don't want to have places where people sit, because if they're sitting, they're not shopping. Quite literally. So that's a design aspect, that's an intentional design aspect. So suburbanization, then, has been crucial. And the other feature of the suburbs that we know about is gated communities. It's actually mentioned, I think, on the back of our program. Gated communities are communities of people who quite literally are seceding from their citizenship. They are saying we are going to live behind walls, our spaces will be private, not public, and we will not have public police, public sanitation, or public education. We will, in effect, we can afford to double tax ourselves, we'll pay taxes a little bit to the public facilities for the poor slobs who can't live inside our gated communities, but we will buy our own sanitation, our own security, and our own education. And in effect, the gated community is not merely symbolically a space that shuts itself off from the public. It is a space that quite literally secedes from the Republic, withdraws its presence from being part of the public. By the way, you should know, the last statistic I saw, and I don't know how reliable it is, says that roughly 55% of Americans live neither in cities, nor towns, nor villages, nor auf das Land, you'd say here, rurally, but live in suburbs. And so we're talking about something like half the population. And while that hasn't been true traditionally in Europe and elsewhere, we know also the same is beginning to happen in other places as well. Now, suburbanization is tied to the second force that's had a very profound impact, and I won't say much about it because we all are so aware of it, privatization and the commercialization that goes with privatization. Privatization is connected to suburbanization and to the culture of commerce because as commerce rises and the power of commerce and those who sell things rises, they more and more begin to believe that they actually can do most of the things that a traditional democratic community or Gemeinde or polis once did. And the essence of neoliberal strategy, represented politically by, say, Ronald Reagan or Margaret Thatcher, was the claim that not only are our political institutions, our governments not very good at solving common problems, they're actually bad at it. They're actually, in Reagan's terms, part of the problem. And the market is the solution. So what we saw from around 1975 or 1980 through today was the displacement of the old mythology of Europe and the Soviet Union, the mythology that states, public states, the Sozialstaat, could solve every problem, and markets could do nothing. We saw the costs in the Soviet Union and elsewhere to liberty and private initiative and entrepreneurship. We saw that mythology pushed aside in the name, not unfortunately of a balance, but of a new mythology, the mythology that markets can do everything and states, political institutions can do absolutely nothing. And this mythology has dominated American politics, and starting 10, 15 years ago, has come to dominate European politics. It's a bipartisan strategy. I worked with President Clinton, and I can tell you that President Clinton was every bit as wedded to privatization and marketization as anyone else. And indeed, the 1996 Federal Communication Act, which displaced the 1934 Federal Communication Act. The 1934 Communication Act said the airwaves are a vital and precious public commodity subject to regulation because public. President Clinton bought the argument that under conditions of spectrum abundance, millions of channels, the internet, that was now no longer necessary. And he said the media are not public, they're private, they can be deregulated, they can be the subject of private manipulation. Anyone who needs a voice can get it without any intervention by the government. That was perhaps the most audacious act of privatization of anyone, much more audacious than a lot of what Reagan did, and that was done by Clinton and the Democrats. So privatization, neoliberalism, the assault on public spaces as incapable of facilitating the kinds of common solutions we look for, was powerful. And with it came also a new set of personalities. If the state can't do it and the market can, that means citizens can't do it, but consumers and producers can. And increasingly, the notion was that consumers can do the work of citizenship. American social scientists talk about voting with dollars, voting with euros. Polling preferences, polling private preferences became a surrogate for voting. In fact, voting was thought of as nothing more than expressing private preferences and then aggregating them. The notion of the last thing a pollster wants to do is have you think about it. Are you sure that's what you want? Are you sure that's what you believe? Do you think your children would agree with you? Would your grandmother like that? On the contrary, give me an instant reaction. Who watched any of the CNN debates, the presidential debates this fall? CNN has an amazing new thing. They run a little line tied up to human bodies of reactions. Literally, they had people reacting word by word, clause by clause, sentence by sentence to the debates. So you could watch people saying, good, not so good, wow, that makes me happy, that doesn't make me so happy. And you watch it. But the notion that human judgment can be fragmented into half-second capsules, and somehow when you see it all as a line, that tells you anything worth knowing with respect to human judgment and citizenship is astonishing. But part of this privatization has created exactly that view of what it means to be a citizen. What it means to be a citizen is to say, moment to moment, second to second, I feel this way, I feel that way, now I feel this way, now I feel that way. The third major force has been globalization. Michael Cern, again, mentioned it. I think it's particularly important, though, because think about it now from the spatial point of view, from the point of view of public spaces. We know that globalization has meant that a lot of the significant major forces and challenges we face are no longer under the purview of sovereign states. We know that global warming, global markets, global terrorism, global crime, global drugs, global weapons have all escaped the frontiers of nation states, and that nations one by one are no longer in a position, at least alone, to deal effectively with them. And in that sense, we are to some degree entering a post-sovereigntist age where even powerful and hegemonic nations like the United States and China are not in a position, as they once were, using their own force and sovereignty to control their destinies. But what has been less commented on is the fact that the new global forces leave us with no global spaces to occupy, to try to begin to think about what it might mean to have transnational democracy, transnational civil society, transnational citizenship. Where do you go, where do you stand if you care about global warming? You can, of course, act globally. You can go in your local community and do a demonstration. You can watch Al Gore talk or buy his video. But where is the place, the space into which you go when you want to work to address these new global challenges to our commonality and to common goods? Where do you stand? Where do you gather to try to find common ground? That term common ground is a nice one. We talk about, in democracy, you've got, no matter how many conflicts you have to find common ground. But by common ground, we talked about sidewalks or the Agora, Country Square. Where is the common ground on which we stand? Someone would say, well, look at this conference. But it's a kind of pathetic tribute to the absence of common ground that probably the best we can do is conferences like this as common international ground. The United Nations, where the representatives of sovereign states come together and do all they can to protect the interests of sovereign states against commonality. Secretary General's office of the UN, I suppose, is a kind of common ground, but there's only one man standing there, Secretary General, which is why he gets so little support when he comes up against sovereign states. So globalization, even more than the other forces, leaves us not only without actual spaces, but without thinkable spaces. I have a hard time. I'll say just in 1 or 2 seconds what some of the responses might be to privatization and suburbanization, but with respect to globalization, I'm not quite sure how you answer that question. How do you find global public space to engender global civil society, global citizenship, global shared ground, global solutions to all the global problems? See, our problems don't need common space, but they are global. Terrorists they need common space with one another. They don't have to agree with us. They can screw things up. Global warming can screw us up. But to fix it, we need common space to begin to devise common democratic responses. And that brings me to the last of the 5 forces, which is digitalization. It's part of the answer, and again, Michael, in his very brief comments, in a much more economical way than I have, mentioned all of these things. Digitalization, some people think, and Lance Bennett's here, and we'll have a chance to talk about some of these things, and there are a lot of Americans who have been thinking about this, and some people elsewhere as well, that maybe in virtual space there is an opportunity to find a global surrogate for the common spaces we no longer have, maybe even in the privatized spaces within sovereign societies. Maybe digital space does that. But so far, at least, and here I agree with Michael, so far, despite the potential architecture of digital technology, despite the lateral interactivity of the internet, so far digital media have added to, contributed to the problem, not to the solution. In part because, like all technologies, they reflect the cultures in which they're made. Every culture that I've ever read about, whose history I know, has always thought technology will transform it, and every culture I know has innovated new technologies that do nothing more than reinforce the values of the culture that produces them. We always say, the engineers say, oh my God, look how different the architecture is, look at the possibilities. But the people who actually make, sell, and use the technology say, oh, all the better to, how about buy and sell with? How about doing pornographic searches with? A society that's dominated by violence, pornography, commerce, gets the internet, gets search engines. You know how many of the search engines on Google are devoted to pornography? You know the top 5, 10, 15 subjects of search on Google? A lot of educators say, well, you miss the importance of Google and the search engines. These other search engines. Britney Spears is number 1, Christina Aguilera is number 2, and so it goes. So yes, these technologies may have, and we'll be talking about that in the coming days, may have a potential to provide new virtual forms of common space where we can stand together virtually and do things using the interactive, lateral, democratic, egalitarian architecture of the internet to do something different than we did with broadcast media. But right now, it reflects the culture, and right now it is subject to the same forces of corporate ownership that the other media are. Because don't kid yourself, the hardware, the software, the platforms, the content of the new media are wholly owned subsidiaries of the same big corporations that run the newspapers and the movies and the advertising concerns. And there's no getting around them. Ask the people in China who hoped when Google came to China they might get a break. But Google, of course, good corporation that it is, with its stakeholder interests, its shareholder interests in the front of its mind, said to China, you don't want keywords like democracy and freedom and Tiananmen Square on the search engine? Consider them gone. Because that's the way these new media work, despite the universal accessibility of the technology, because they are owned by corporations who, and I don't criticize them for it, Google owes their shareholders the China sale. And they'd be fools not to make the China sale, but they are a private corporation, not a public corporation. And that's precisely the difference. So while the new media have this extraordinary set of possibilities, I mean, even look at the names. MySpace, YouTube. Where's our space? Where's our tube? Where are the really common spaces? Facebook and MySpace and so many of these new technologies have become exercises in fragmentary narcissism. Students use them not to get to know strangers, but to figure out who their friends are at the colleges they're going to so they don't have to encounter strangers, which is one of the main reasons to go to the university. But they figure out, who's just like me and who has my interests, and you can find all that out on Facebook or MySpace, and you go there and you find it out, and you arrive at the university, and you can have your safe little private community. The very opposite of the democratic space that, in fact, a university should be. So there, the new free technology is being used to further privatize, depublicize what should be the public experience of schooling. So it ain't pretty, in short, where we are today, and I'll just say one word about the finance crisis, because the missing term here has been an analysis of trust. We know what the banking crisis is about. We know that all banks are leveraged. We know that people put money in, they put mortgages in, and then the banks lend most of it out again. They don't keep much of it. It's called leveraging. It's a little problem if people want their money back, because a given bank or insurance company or investment firm at any one moment have anywhere from 5 to 10% of their assets. The other 90% they've given away, not given away, lent out. So if I suddenly want it back, I can't get it. But if I come and demand it, the minute it's 11%, not 10%, which is what they have, they go bankrupt. They go under. That's what a run on the banks is. This has been a run on the banks, but a run on the banks becomes, of course, a run on the institutions that hold the paper that banks have given out, and the people who have rebundled the paper and hold that paper. And that means that this is ultimately a crisis, not in economic assets, but in social trust. Not in economic capital, but in social capital. Because what is missing here is trust. And if you think it's just about an economic asset, then you have to answer this puzzle. A week and a half ago on Monday, the United States Congress refused to pass a $700 billion bailout bill, and the stock market went down 488 points. As a result, the following Friday, Congress passed the bill. The result, stock market went down 800 points. Now, something's wrong with that picture, and what's wrong with it is it's not about economic capital, it's not about pumping money, and that's the technical fix. Technically, yes, you've got to raise the level of assets so they can pay off the bad debt and still have money to lend. But the fact is, trust has vanished from a system. Well, Marx knew a long time ago that the cold cash nexus was all that was at the heart of Marxism, and capitalists know that too, and they're proud of it. And they should be, because that's how it works. But capitalism has always depended on the social trust and social capital created by democratic, political, and civil society institutions. And the slow erosion of that trust over the last 40 years has made this crisis much worse than it had to be, and leaves the politicians without solutions, because what they really wanted to say, and Henry Paulson first said that, is trust me. And they said, are you kidding? And then the bank said, well, trust us. And he said, are you kidding? And the hedge funds said, trust us. And now sovereign asset funds are saying, trust us. Nobody trusts anyone, and that's the way capitalism wants it. It's not based on trust, it's based on calculated interest. But calculated interest only takes you so far. You've, in fact, got to have the social capital, the social assets, the trust, the confidence that you get from democracy, from public space. This is, I know, not an American audience. The most popular film ever in America is a film called It's a Wonderful Life with Jimmy Stewart. Who has seen that film? Jimmy Stewart, It's a Wonderful Life. Okay, well, it's a remarkable film. Shown every Christmas. It's a feel-good film. But it's actually about the financial crisis right now. And I wish the bankers would all go and see it, because they could figure it out. Jimmy Stewart owns a little bank. There's a big bad bank in town that just works on heartless, cold instinct, but he has a nice bank. He misplaces some money, and there's a run on his bank. And he's the nicest man in town, but he's going to be destroyed. His bank is falling down. He tries to get the other bank to lend him money, but they're glad to see that the competitor go under. And the whole thing has gone down the drain. Until suddenly, there's a little subplot I won't talk about, where he has a dream, in effect, that the town is the town that would be if he weren't there with his little bank, and what a horrible town it is, and all the good things are gone. But at the end of the movie, his friends, his neighbors, all show up at the house. And they say, your bank's going under. Here's money, here's some stuff, here's some bread for your family to eat. I'll put my account back, I'll put my money back in the bank. And what you get there is, as a result, the salvation of the bank and the town, not because someone put up hard, cold cash, but because neighbors who had created a sense of strong citizenship and neighborliness came together and saved the bank. This world right now is waiting to find some neighbors who will come together and save the world economic system, but it spent the last 40 years destroying them. And now can't quite understand where the citizens are who ought to step in and take a strong role and reestablish trust in the system. So that is the problem we face. I was going to, but I won't because we're out of time, and I'm going to stop so Klaus can come and do the second half of this. But let me just say, I think one of the things we want to try to do, because we've started with a message of kind of despair, is to ask, where in the suburbs, in privatization, in globalization, in digitalization, can we find moments of hope? Are there ways that we can push back? And how does that happen? Our title says rise. I don't know if that's just wishful thinking or maybe, an actual description of something, but we certainly want to look for where we might find, whether it's on the internet or in the suburbs or in malls that are beginning to try to look more like city centers, town centers, by having a post office and a theater and residential space in them. There are people trying to convert malls back into towns. There are people trying to convert the internet back into a public, a common space, whether it's the Electronic Frontier Foundation or the Berkman Institute at Harvard or others who are actually working to figure out how to do those things. Same with global space, international civil society. So for me, our challenge over the next days is, in part, of course, the challenge. Some people might want to say they're much too gloomy or much too pessimistic about this, but assuming we to some extent buy what Michael started with and what I'm continuing with, I think Klaus is going to some degree agree that we're in trouble, that our public spaces are in trouble. Where do we look for the response? How do we respond to that? And I will end with just one word. I won't talk about it here. I hope to talk about it over the next couple of days. Artists. I believe the arts have a fundamental and crucial role to play in both kindling and rekindling public spaces. We see it here in Berlin. That's why Berlin is one of the most attractive cities to young people. In Germany, it's certainly not because of its industry or big business or banks. You go to Frankfurt for that. But the arts, though they bankrupted the city, to be sure, are nonetheless a crucial piece of what makes Berlin attractive and what makes Berlin feel so much like a civic place to live. So the clue I'll drop here is that for me, the arts have to play, along with a lot of other things, a crucial role. That, I think, is the challenge we face, and I hope in the next days we can look at these issues. Thank you very much.